for everybody else. It is a blessing to have this time to encourage you from God's word, and I have been greatly blessed as well in this time of prayer, the songs, and the updates as well. Well, I'd like to begin by introducing my talk today with the title, The Raging Dragon, the Woman, and the Child. This is taken from the book of Revelation, specifically Revelation chapter 12. And before we dive into this chapter, I want to give you a little bit of a background concerning this chapter and how it fits in the book of Revelation, which I think is helpful for us as we delve into this. Revelation 12 is in the midst of the second major interlude in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation provides for us a sequence of future events, but there are a few portions in the book where the sequence is paused and the Lord provides some additional information concerning characters and circumstances in the future tribulation. Revelation 12 is in the middle of the second great interlude. This interlude began in chapter 11 rather, and extends through to chapter 14. And chapter 12 really needs to be understood with chapter 13. 12 and 13 introduce the readers to three great enemies of the plan of God and the people of God. These three great enemies are the dragon, who dominates chapter 12, and the second character is the beast, chapter 13, verses 1 to 10, and the third major character is the second beast, also known as the false prophet, and that's chapter 13, verses 11 to 18. So what you actually have in Revelation chapters 12 to 13 is an unholy trinity. You have these three enemies, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, who all oppose the plan of God and the people of God. It's in chapter 12, though, that we're going to focus in on the work of the dragon. He is the mastermind behind these three, and we're going to specifically see the raging works of this dragon as he attacks the woman and the child. Well, let me summarize chapter 12 for you just briefly by giving you a bit of a word picture. And after I set this up, I want to then break this down and work through this entire chapter. By making use of very graphic and symbolic language, John sees this vision of a fiery red dragon. You really are supposed to picture an ugly, scary sight. You're supposed to picture something that is angry. And this dragon is standing in opposition against a woman who is heavily pregnant. She is in a very vulnerable condition. And as this woman is with child, this dragon is standing against her, roaring and raging, seeking to devour her. Suddenly, this woman gives birth to a male child, and the dragon continues to rage, but this male child ultimately has victory. Once the dragon realizes he cannot destroy the child, he turns against the woman again. And not only does he turn against the woman, he turns against the woman and all of her offspring. That's the story of Revelation chapter 12. What I want to do in this message is work through the language found in this chapter and provide an understanding concerning what is going on here. Now, I'm going to do this by looking at this chapter, which is divided into two major sections. So what I want you to see as we go through this section is these two important realities. What we see in this chapter is verses 1 to 6, and that contains for us 2 wonders. And then we're going to see in this same chapter 2 wars, verses 7 through to 19. So let's begin with the very first part of this chapter, and that is 2 wonders. Now, what I want you to note as you look at verses 1 through to 6 of Revelation chapter 12 is a word that is repeated 2 times in this section. The first time it appears is in verse 1, and it's the word sign. We read, "And a great sign appeared." And then go down to verse 3, "And another sign appeared." What we have here is 2 signs. The fact that it's called a sign indicates that these images are pointing to a reality. So this gives us the clue that what we're going to be reading here is symbolic language that is pointing to a reality. So though we're going to be reading some very elaborate language about a raging dragon, we're going to see what this dragon symbolizes, and particularly his activities. I call these signs 2 wonders because you'll note in verse 1 that the first sign is called a great sign. This is a sign that gets your attention. These are significant. So let's begin first of all with the 2 wonders. And I want to begin with the first one. It's found in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12, and that is titled The Woman. Have a look at the text. "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth." The very first sign that John sees here is the sign of a woman. And you'll notice the description that this woman has in this text. She's clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of these 12 stars. And of course, we see that later on she'll be with child and she'll cry out in labor pains. The question before us is to identify this woman. Who is the woman that John sees in this vision? There actually are many interpretations concerning the identity of the woman, but I'm only going to give you 3 of the most common. The first view that is held by a number of scholars is the woman in Revelation chapter 12 is in reference to the Virgin Mary. And the rationale behind this really is that this woman carries a child, and the child is the Messiah. And we read, of course, in the Isaiah prophecy of Isaiah 7 and verse 14 and over in Matthew chapter 1, that Mary is the one who will carry this child. She is the one with child. She is the one who experiences the labor. She is the one who gives birth to the Messiah. And it's actually quite fascinating. If you look at a lot of Roman Catholic art over the years, we're talking about paintings, but also sculptures, you'll actually see Revelation chapter 12 with a woman, and it is evidently the Virgin Mary. So this really comes out in a lot of their teachings. John Paul II himself was an individual who even affirmed this view in more contemporary times. But the problem with interpreting the woman in Revelation 12 as the Virgin Mary is problematic because we read later on in this chapter that after Jesus ascends to heaven and we catapult into a future time, which I'll explain in a few moments, but the future time is talking about the moments before the Messiah returns to the world in the great second coming, the woman is still on earth. So if this is a reference to the Virgin Mary, this means that she continues to be living on the earth today, and she will continue to live on the earth until the arrival of the Messiah. And of course, such a notion is preposterous. It's not possible, and that is not what this text is referring to. So we can eliminate the interpretation that says the woman in Revelation 12, verses 1 to 2, is the Virgin Mary. A second interpretation is to view the woman as the church. The church is the one who is being persecuted in these verses. But again, there's a glaring problem if we interpret the woman in Revelation 12, 1 and 2 as the church. The glaring problem is the woman labored in birth pains, giving birth to the Messiah. This would mean that the church was in existence before the arrival of the Messiah. And of course, we know that's not true. The church did not come into existence until Acts chapter 2, after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. So the woman can't be a reference to the church. But this has led people to a third interpretation, and that is the woman is a reference to Israel. Now, why would people interpret the woman as a reference to the nation of Israel? There's a number of reasons for this. One of those reasons is because throughout the Old Testament, particularly when you read books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea, Israel is given the title of being the wife of God. We're also told in Isaiah 27 the language of Israel being in labor pains. But more compelling to help us understand that this is a reference to Israel is not just the fact that Israel is referred to in this language, but we read this in Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 and 10. This here is taken from the episode of Joseph receiving dreams by means of divine revelation. Joseph, we remember, shared these dreams with his brothers, which of course didn't end well for him initially, as they wanted to eliminate him and sell him off to be a slave in Egypt. But we read these words in Genesis 37, verses 9 to 10. Then he dreamed still another dream, and he told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bow down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" What we have here is language found in Joseph's dream. Joseph's dream here is talking about the picture of his family coming to bow before him, which becomes an image for the nation of Israel. And here in Revelation chapter 12, the language of Genesis 37 referencing the nation of Israel is used in description to this woman. So joining together the idea of the language of Genesis 37 and the frequent usage of Israel being referred to as a woman, as a wife of, as a mother giving birth in Isaiah 26, in Isaiah 66, in the book of Hosea 13, we conclude that the woman here in Revelation chapter 12 is referring to the nation of Israel. But what I want you to now see is something else very interesting. We see in verses 3 to 4 the second wonder. And this second wonder is a great red dragon. Let's have a look at verses 3 and 4. "And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven, and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. This description is indicating that there is one who is going to rage against the woman. He is described as a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. The fact that he's described as a fiery red dragon is language used in the book of Revelation, particularly red, concerning bloodshed and murder. An example of that would be seen in one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation chapter 6, which refers to war and bloodshed. The fact that this dragon is described in this language certainly is connected to what Jesus said concerning Satan in the Gospel of John chapter 8 and verse 44, that he is a liar from the beginning and he is a murderer. So this dragon is described as one who brings about bloodshed. But interestingly enough, he's also said to have 7 heads. Now, in the vision, this certainly looks like a scary sight, but the 7 heads are symbolic of something. Always remember that the number 7 in the book of Revelation is a number that indicates completion and fullness. The number 7 here is really drawn from language taken from the book of Daniel chapter 7, in which we learn about 7 successive empires. And the 7th head here refers to the final empire that will come into power prior to Christ's second coming. The 10 horns refer to 10 powers, a 10-nation confederacy that will arise from the 7th head in the last days. So as we see this, we also need to be reminded that this description is also used in the next chapter of the beast, who is described in the same way. Satan energizes the beast. So the idea here is the dragon is the one who is actually ruling and energizing the world system. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4 tells us that the God of this world has blinded the minds of those who do not believe. Or 1 John chapter 5 and verse 19, the whole world lays under the sway of the evil one. The description of him having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads is a very elaborate way of describing the global control and influence Satan has over the world, but it is also highlighting that this is going to escalate just before the arrival of the Messiah. But then we're told about something historic in verse 4. Verse 4 tells us that his tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. The term stars appears frequently in the book of Revelation, and there are places where stars refer to literal stars, but stars are also frequently used to describe angelic beings. This appears to be the historic rebellion of Satan. This is probably a reference to what we read about in Isaiah 14, 12 to 15, and Ezekiel 28. Where we learn that Satan, who was originally created as an angelic being, he was in the glory of heaven. He was the light bearer, an angel of great power, an angel of great beauty, perhaps a chief musician before the throne, being filled with pride, rebelled. And as he rebelled, he was expelled from the glory of heaven, losing his position, status, and abode. And according to Revelation 12:4, he drew 1/3 of the stars, indicating a number of rebels who joined him, 1/3 of the angels of heaven joining him in this rebellion. But the text goes on to say that the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth. The idea of the word stood here is he has historically stood against her and continues to stand. The dragon rages against this woman. This indicates a perpetual stance of opposition against her. What's happening here? Well, the picture really is Israel is ready to give birth and bring forth the Messiah, the promised Messiah, the Messiah who has been promised in prophecies and promises and pictures throughout the Old Testament. The Messiah is about to arrive on the scene. And the dragon is doing all he can to prevent the arrival of the Messiah. And as we read the Old Testament scriptures, we learn that Satan has been doing this throughout history. Now, I don't have time to look at each and every one of the events, but let me just highlight a few. You think about Exodus chapter 1. In Exodus chapter 1, you have Pharaoh seeking to eliminate the male children born of the Hebrew women. Here is a work in which Satan is behind that monstrous act of Pharaoh, that atrocity that Pharaoh was committing. But here is a work of Satan behind the scenes, raging against the woman, trying to prevent the arrival of the Messiah. We read about the many attempts of Saul seeking to eliminate and kill David. Satan knows that through David would come this promise. David is this chosen heir. Of course, we read in the book of Esther, and we read in Persia of this attempt to eliminate the Jewish people. We move all the way to 2 Chronicles 21 to 22, and we learn that the royal line from which the Messiah would eventually come was reduced down to only one individual, and that was baby Joash. And all of this came as a result of the evil actions of Athaliah. In the New Testament, Matthew chapter 2, we have Herod, who was paranoid, demanding that the male children in Bethlehem and the surrounding regions 2 years and younger be murdered. Now, when we think of all of these monstrous acts, as we think of these examples of the Jewish people undergoing persecution and actual attempts, and not only attempts, but follow through acts in which there was murder and bloodshed, we are to understand behind these physical activities throughout the biblical story is a great fiery red dragon who is standing before Israel, and he is trying to devour this child. And the greatest example of him trying to devour her was in that last one that I gave, and that is in the work of Herod as he tried to eliminate this child as soon as it was born. So let's just briefly review what we have here before we move on to see what comes of this child. John receives this incredible vision, a vision that consists of two wonders. The two wonders are seen by these two signs, the woman and the dragon. The woman represents the nation of Israel, and the second wonder is the picture of the dragon, and the dragon is Satan himself, and he is doing all he can to eliminate the arrival of her promised seed, and that is the child, the Messiah. Now, as we continue to read on in the text, we read in verses 5 to 6 this: she bore a male child who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there for 1,260 days. Now, this is really fascinating before we move to the next section of Revelation chapter 12. What I want you to see here is what we've read so far in Revelation chapter 12 all takes place prior to the arrival of the Messiah. Then when she gives birth, that obviously brings us into the gospel accounts. But we notice here in verse 5 that she gives birth to this child. The child arrives, and there is this reference to him being a ruler of the nations. This, of course, is making use of the language of Psalm 2. Psalm 2 is going to be fulfilled in the book of Revelation, particularly in the future messianic kingdom of the Messiah, which we learn about in chapter 20, verses 1 through to 10. But fascinatingly, after we learn about the birth of this child, there is no mention of his earthly life. There is no mention of his miracles, no mention of his teaching, no mention of his crucifixion, no mention of his burial or resurrection. We just simply go straight to his ascension and also to the right hand of the Father, and ultimately the picture of the moment in history when he returns, when he takes the throne of David and he rules as Messiah. Why does the text just jump forward to this? Because this is preparing us for verses 7 to 17, which explains events that are going to take place in the future, events that are going to take place just before the arrival of the Messiah. So that's what verse 5 is doing. But verse 6 then tells us that the woman flees into the wilderness. This is, again, is a reference to Israel. Israel flees. And she goes to a place prepared by God, and she is going to be protected there for 1,260 days. Now, this is a very curious moment. The question is, what is this referring to? Well, I just want to note that the reference to 1,260 days is the same amount of time in the previous chapter in which we learn about two witnesses, chapter 11 and verse 3. And they prophesy for 1,260 days. This time of 1,260 days is a reference to a period of time in which God is going to protect the nation of Israel. Now, we're going to learn more about what that is and when that will be in our next point. But what I want you to see in these first 6 verses is this stunning sign, the stunning picture of this understanding that throughout the course of history, there has been this raging battle occurring behind the scenes. It is Satan doing all he can to prevent the arrival of the Messiah. Even when the Messiah was born, he was continuing to rage and trying to eliminate him. But the Messiah was victorious. He ruled. He rose from the dead. He has ascended to heaven, and he will rule the nations one day. And the woman now knows that the attention is going to be focused on her, so she flees to the wilderness. So we're now going to learn what that refers to in this next point. So let's have a look now in Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through to 17. Now, the first section, verses 1 to 6, was 2 wonders, the woman and the dragon. Verses 7 to 17 is 2 wars. And one war takes place in heaven, verses 7 to 12, and the second war takes place on earth, verses 13 to 17. So let's have a look at the first war, and that is the war in heaven. We begin in verse 7. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his archangels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. The first war is in heaven. Though Satan has already rebelled and been cast out of heaven, remember verse 4, he evidently has been granted access to heaven since that first rebellion. And we learn about that in the book of Job, for example. In Job chapter 1, verses 6 to 12, you see that Satan, though he's rebelled and has been expelled from heaven, still has access by divine permission. And there he makes accusations to God concerning Job, but he also accuses God of being too gracious to Job. But here we see in Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 to 9, of a future expulsion from the glory of heaven. We learn that a war breaks out in heaven, and Michael, along with an army of angels, fight against Satan and his followers, verse 7. And then what takes place is Satan is defeated and definitively cast out of heaven to the earth. And we see that in verse 9. And notice the language that builds up here. He is called the serpent of old. He's called the devil and Satan indicating that he is the accuser. And the reference to the serpent of old is a reminder of the deception that was on display back in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. What these verses are describing is a future war that is going to break out in the glory of heaven. And God is going to dispatch Michael and a number of the angels to fight against this dragon, and he will no longer be granted access to the glory of heaven. He is going to be cast down to the earth. Now, it's interesting that a number of scholars, particularly those who are of an amillennial persuasion, will read this passage and they will really interpret this as a reference to Revelation chapter 20, which is referring to the future binding of Satan during the millennium. And they would say those two passages are to be understood together. So in other words, an amillennialist would say the binding of Satan in Revelation chapter 20 is simply describing the same event of Revelation chapter 12. And that's referring to something that took place at the cross. They don't see this as a future event. But the problem with this is what happens in verses 10 to 12. In verses 10 to 12, there is this great celebration in the glory of heaven once Satan is expelled. Now, note carefully what is said here. Now, salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they have overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. So here is this certain victory in heaven that's calling the victory already. Though the battle isn't over, a victory is sure. But then notice what it says in the second half of verse 12. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. This is referring to a time period in which Satan now knows his moment is brief. Before he is going to be defeated finally, before he is cast into final judgment, he has a brief period of time. This brief period of time is what was mentioned back in verse 5, and it's the 1260 days. This is referring to the Great Tribulation. Now, interesting, when you read Revelation 12, you should read Revelation 12 with Daniel 12 open. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who is charge over your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered." In Daniel chapter 12, we read about a time in which Michael will be dispatched to be used as an agent who brings protection to the people of Israel. This aligns with what Revelation 12 is describing. Revelation 12, verses 7 to 12, is referring to a future war in heaven in which Satan is no longer allowed any access to heaven, and Satan then comes down to earth and he puts his full focus in on the inhabitants of the earth, and he is going to rage, and he's going to do this specifically against the woman, against the people of Israel. And Satan knows that his time is brief. And this is now what leads me to the last part of chapter 12, and that is the war on earth. The war happens on earth because Satan has been cast down. So let's have a look now at verses 13 to 17. We read, "Now, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." This second war is on earth. In this section, the dragon now turns his attention on the woman and her offspring. But notice in verse 14, God protects the woman. We're told that the woman is given 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might fly away from that dragon into the wilderness. What is this describing? There have been all sorts of interpretations on this. We know as a minimum, verse 14 is simply saying the people of Israel are going to be protected. They're going to be preserved. But one thing I think we need to always remember when we read the book of Revelation is we need to be really familiar with the Old Testament. Now, the book of Revelation nowhere directly quotes word for word from the Old Testament. It comes close in chapter 2 when one of the 7 churches is being addressed, the church in Thyatira, but nowhere is a direct quotation given in the book of Revelation. But there are over 300 clear Old Testament allusions. So what that means is, if you're going to understand the symbolic language in the book of Revelation, if you're going to understand the language in general of the book of Revelation, you really need to be acquainted with the Old Testament. And when you read Revelation 12 and you look here at this reference in verse 14 concerning this protection of the woman and her being carried away by eagle's wings, you will learn that this is actually imagery taken from the book of Exodus, chapter 19 and verse 14, when God said to Israel that he had carried them out of Egypt on eagle's wings. So this is a way of talking about a divine protection that was secure and it was swift. I don't think we need to read much more into this other than to affirm that just as God had physically and sovereignly and safely protected Israel from the Egyptians in times past, so God will sovereignly and swiftly protect Israel from the dragon in the future when he pours out his fury against her. But notice that verse 14 not only tells us that God will protect her, but God sends her away to a wilderness, a place where she'll be nourished. In other words, she'll be protected for a time and times and half a time. What's this referring to? Well, this here is referring to a time period that is described in 3 different ways in the book of Revelation. It's described as 1,260 days. It's described as a time, times, and half a time here. And it's also defined as 42 months. All 3 of those refer to the same period of time. Now, this is referring to the last half of the final tribulation, the Great Tribulation. This is what Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1 refers to as a time of trouble. Israel will experience a time of trouble like she has never experienced before. So what we have here is during this great tribulation period, during this 3.5 years when Satan has all restraints off and will seek to obliterate Israel, Israel is going to be protected. Now, if you were to go back to the book of Daniel and read in chapter 11, verses 41 down to the end of the chapter, you'll find out that there are some places like Moab and Edom that are going to be spared from the attacks of the future Antichrist, and they likely will be the places that Israel will find refuge in during this time. Nonetheless, verse 14 tells us that Israel will be nourished and protected for those 3.5 years. Then we continue to read in verse 15 that Satan, in verses 15 to 16, is going to seek to completely obliterate her. And in the midst of these horrendous acts of rage, God will protect and preserve his people. We also learn in verse 17 that the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Her offspring are described as those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. The natural question that we need to ask at this point is, if the woman refers to Israel, then who are the offspring of Israel? Well, there are a number of proposals when it comes to this question, and you could imagine people will go in all sorts of directions seeking to answer this. Some people refer to the offspring here as the church. I don't take that view because the church has been raptured out of the world at this time. Some people refer to this exclusively as Gentile believers, and that view is drawn from the fact that Revelation chapter 7 teaches us about the 144,000, and we learn about the converts of that 144,000, which is an innumerable sized crowd. Other people take the seed of the woman to just simply be a reference to the 144,000. Again, they're mentioned in chapter 7 and chapter 14, and these 144,000 appear to be a large group of Jewish evangelists who are called the first fruits. And they're mentioned in chapter 14 as the first fruits, and some view them as that. It's interesting that the offspring of the woman are described as those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. This clearly tells us that they're converted. And it's interesting that when you read in the book of Revelation, the terms keeping of the commandments of God and the word testimony concerning Jesus is used both of Jewish converts and of Gentile converts. So it's possible that the offspring of the woman are simply referring to all who have come to believe the gospel message during this time. But regardless of what one's view is here, the main point is Satan has been raging against this woman, but he cannot annihilate her. He cannot remove her. And the reason for this is because God has made a covenant with her, and he has promised to preserve her. And he has a plan in which he will fulfill all the covenant promises, the promises made to Abraham, the promises made to David. And these promises will be fulfilled after the arrival of the Messiah, as he lands on the Mount of Olives, splitting it in two, establishing his throne, ruling over the nations. And there we will see the promises made to the nation of Israel come to fruition. So as we step back now from Revelation chapter 12, you can see that this is an epic chapter. It's an intense chapter. It's a chapter that shows us and tells us so much about the raging battle that has been happening throughout the ages. But what we need to remember as we look at Revelation chapter 12 is this. Though the dragon is raging, the time is coming in which Christ will rule. He has risen from the dead. The Messiah has ascended to the glory of heaven. There he is right now, preparing a place. There he is, ready to be dispatched to come back the second time. But before his great return, we are going to see a work in the future in which a time of unparalleled trouble is going to come upon the nation of Israel. Revelation 12 gives us the background. It tells us what's happening behind the curtain. Satan is going to put all his energy into the extinguishing of the nation of Israel, but he will not succeed because God will preserve and protect her. Now, of course, when we read Revelation chapter 12, we read this with the knowledge and the understanding that there will be in these last days a time of a national conversion of the people of Israel. They will repent of their sins. They will trust in Jesus as their Messiah. Romans 11 and verse 26 tells us that all Israel will be saved. There will be a time of great persecution in which 2/3 will be killed, according to the book of Zechariah. But the nation will not be obliterated. She will flee into the wilderness for 3.5 years, and there God will protect and preserve her. The dragon is raging, but Christ will be ruling. That is the message of Revelation chapter 12. Allow me to close in a word of prayer. Our gracious and mighty God, I want to thank you for the privilege of being able to open up your word and talk about this great chapter that outlines for us what has happened before us and what will also happen in the future. And this reminds us that you are sovereign. You are on your throne and your plan is unfolding. But it also teaches us to be discerning, to recognize that there is constantly a war going on behind the scenes. And though our hearts are grieved by the horrendous and monstrous acts in which we see attacks come upon the nation of Israel, we know and understand why. And we even know that this will intensify in the future. But help us to always remember with great confidence that you are in control and the plan of Christ will unfold. And we long for that day when Jesus will come and take us out of this world and we will return with him in that moment of splendor in which the sky will be torn open. The Messiah will descend on a white horse with the armies of heaven behind him. There he will defeat every enemy and land on the Mount of Olives, establishing his great and glorious kingdom. We look forward to this great day, and we thank you in Christ's name. Amen.